So first of all, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Sasha, for inviting me. It's an awesome place. I feel very small here, so I hope I can feel a little bit of this space here today. So when someone introduces me, it's always a little bit confusing. People from other professions may ask if I'm a type designer. I am not a type designer. But I'm not an illustrator neither. This is another frequent question. But I use both type and illustration in my work in a very active way. So here I'm going to try to make a connection between these two both disciplines. So I studied graphic design in Barcelona. Then I worked in 2 different graphic design studios. And then I began to build my own project 8 years ago now. So this would be a kind of synthesis of my professional life. So yeah, I could say that graphic design is my thing. I think what I do is to give graphic ideas into illustration and letter forms. But in fact, my background is a little bit more complex than that. Because I've studied psychology, I worked in advertising agencies, I did a little bit of signage, a little bit of calligraphy, and all this is fitting my work in the graphic design field. So here we have an overview of my work, and I think when you look at it, you see that it's very eclectic. Sorry for the colors. Color is really important in my work, and of course always the projectors messed up a little bit. But you'll see that there are letters, there are illustrations, but there is one common thread between all these images, and it is the urge of expression. And I think it is also an answer to a functional use for the media that I work with. My clients are in the editorial industry. I work for magazines, for book publishers, and for advertising. And here I want to stop for a moment and talk about a quote from Eric Gill. I recently read an essay on typography, and it made me think about our relationship with advertising. And it says, and it nauseates also because it reminds us of the unrelieved acquisitiveness of the unfortunate shopkeepers who, in our absurd financial chaos, cannot persuade us to buy their wretched wares unless they blind and blast our eyes. So, imagine that was in 1931. What would say Eric Gill if he opened his eyes today? So, if letters are signs for sounds, that was what he was saying, I think this new year is making so much noise that designers are often asked to write louder and louder in an effort to stand apart from all this noise. And louder meaning many times being more expressive. So when I design, there are 2 goals that I try to achieve with the same effort. The first one is to do something that is eye-catching. So as Paula Sharon mentioned last year here at Typographics, a poster is to post a notice, so you're supposed to notice it. Same thing happens with a book cover, magazine cover, an ad you just see on the street. So if we don't catch the attention, then we can't reach the next goal, which is to inform, to explain something so you want to buy the book or the magazine or whatever product you're trying to sell. Going back to the work overview, last of all, I work for cultural projects where usually not a lot of money is involved, but where you're allowed to take much more risks. And paradoxically, these are the kind of projects that fit the commercial ones. Probably this is because in a commercial project, there's the need of evidence that something is actually working before going into that direction. So many times, or sometimes when I work, I feel like a kind of tourist designer, and you may probably also have been there at least once in your life. If the creative process is like a journey, sometimes we behave like tourist designers. So what is a tourist designer? Tourist designer is like a tourist that has a superficial view of the territory, and that, for example, just wants to go to New York and fly to New York to check that the Tour Eiffel is actually there. The Tour Eiffel, okay. No, the Empire State. I'm not in Paris, so, okay. So a tourist is just willing to recognize. He's seen the Empire State millions, thousands of times in photographs and still needs to make his own photograph of it. and recognize, meaning to know again something that he already knows. So usually when there's no time for for work, we use kind of a touristic package and go to this result that we know it works, but that doesn't give us back anything. And this, when it happens like after a lot of time, always using this kind of process, it can be frustrating and in an uncomfortable feeling of demotivation. We rush and try to choose another path. But since we haven't explored it yet before, there's no time to explore. We just fail and have to take the usual path again, which is very, very frustrating. So if I always use this attitude versus my work, it ended up being a fatal wound for my creativity. So there's still the urge to have a different relationship with creativity, changing the attitude towards a more nomadic approach. Nomadic designers would be constantly looking for better life conditions, would find the time to go backwards, to go forwards, would embrace accidents, wouldn't be afraid of the unknown, and would not stay in the same place forever, meaning maybe not staying in the same style all your life, no? I feel also nomadic in the way pushpin graphics were at the time, with their eclectic historical references that fed their work. And in a digital sense, also jumping from 3D software to vector, painting, image ones. So yes, for those who spotted freehand there, believe it or not, it still exists, and I still use it and love it like the very first time. So I use my hands sometimes, but mainly with a computer, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later. Finally, nomadic in a physical sense. I've been living and working in my hometown, Barcelona, in New York, the last couple of years in LA, and now in Amsterdam, where I just recently moved, and it is my new home. So let's go to work. We're going to walk through a gradient of work that will go from calligraphy to illustration. We will begin with a lettering commission for Esquire magazine that ended with a type experiment through digital effects. And to explain this project, I have to talk a little bit of the influence of calligraphy. I don't do calligraphy for a living, but it is something that I enjoy very much doing in my free time. So I attend to workshops learning different historical styles. And the reason is because, of course, I'm interested in the nature of letters, but also in the process, which is very different from the one I use in a digital lettering or an illustration, but in a digital environment. If the day-to-day of work is like a countdown, where an error pops up, we just can press a key and poof, it's gone, no? It's too easy not to see an opportunity there instead of an error. So calligraphy gives me the opportunity to embrace error. It's like going to the gym and training the eye to undo something with mistakes, because when you mess up, you really have to decide if you do something with a mistake or you just begin again. We are also under so many stimuli that calligraphy feels like a parenthesis from all this noise. There's actually a study that proves that now we generally lose concentration after 8 seconds. So these are the effects of an increasingly digitalized lifestyle on our brain. So the art director Pierre Stravinsky sent me this brief where they were looking for a fancy shopping backfill to reinforce the idea of the headline, which was the best men's shops in America. We talked to work around a copperplate elegant kind of style, which I knew how to write from the workshops, or a Spencerian kind of style. So if calligraphy is related to writing, then lettering is related to drawing, where the headline is rendered. In my work, the closest relationship between illustration and typography would usually start here, where by drawing letters, not by writing them. So for example, here I just draw the skeleton of the letters I used to write with a calligraphy pen, and the ornament with no contrast, like if it was a thread, applying all the rules that I learned doing calligraphy, such as having consistent sized loops throughout the lettering, having a visual symmetry, not a literal symmetry. So I usually don't do historical styles, digital historical styles, if I haven't tried it before with my own hands. And usually my goal, usually not always, but usually is not to make a literal imitation of the handwriting in the computer, because I think that would be a kind of a losing game, but to bring into a digital environment where things tend to be less fluid, embracing and reinforcing that aspect. For example, here I really force the inclination to reinforce this idea. Sometimes it is more about to bring a certain calligraphic vibe to a simpler letter form, or something that would imitate the pen pressure or different kind of pen strokes. And talking about pen strokes, one day this happy accident happened. It looked as if you were writing or trying to write with a pen that was actually running out of ink. And I thought it would be interesting to apply this into a digital this digital effect into a script. So what I did was I began to draw the alphabet, having the square lettering as a reference, but of course drawing a script, come on, I mean, not a lettering was not the best of the ideas. Luckily for me, when I applied the effect to all the letters, the marker, it began to fade always at the end of each letter. That meant that I was liberated from most of the headaches concerning the connections of each letter. Yeah, good for me. And that was how adeu, that means goodbye in Catalan, was born. So here I went from lettering to typography. I had to look for the whole consistency of the alphabet. The texture was a bit more complex than a lettering. Now we're doing short videos for each letter because it looks like this has to be on movement. But still seeing how this could live besides being an experiment. Any ideas are welcome. The next project, the letters start to fade out and stand just in the border where illustration begins. So this project was for a cover for a touristic guide of Barcelona, but it was not a regular guide. It was guiding you through the places where locals go. It was revealing secret places or hidden places for tourists. So the idea here was to show the hidden parts of the letters within the word B-side, that was the name of the guide. So I would bend the letters until the back side of the word would pop out. So here we have some examples of this idea. The oldest that I was able to find was this example by Willem Gronau from the early 19th century. But maybe the most celebrated one was the typeface hologram shadow by Milton Glaser. I also found this anonymous example from the 80s that looked like a roll of photographic film, and also the digital bended words by Felix Fluffy. So first of all, I designed the word B-side in a very condensed style so I could bend it properly. And then I brought it into Cinema 4D and tried to apply it on different basic shapes, such as a cone, a cube, or a cylinder. Until I got this, where the letters were nearly touching on the backside, nearly on the tips. Once I got it, I just brought it into a vector software, vectorized it, and then colored it, giving emphasis on the three-dimensionality of the lettering, and trying to go for a kind of Japanese style where the illustration, in this case the lettering, got all the attention in comparison with informative text. Here you can see the final cover. The next project was made for a limited edition book celebrating the first decade of the OFF festival. So Basava, the studio that was designing the book, asked me to create a fictional writing. 3 spreads of imaginary scriptures to give more depth and appearance of plausibility to the book. So they pretended that the book itself was found somewhere by an Indian professor and that it already existed since a long time ago. So he had the work of decipher the book and the scriptures. About the tone of it, they were asking for a visual language that would clash between the primitivism and the uber-futurism. And I was looking at the history of writing to see if I could see like some references. And I had to think that picture writing was in fact the beginning of our lettering. If you wish to communicate something to someone that you don't share any language with at a distance, what is more universal universally readable than a picture or a drawing. So in the very roots of the written language, we find drawings, not letters. But a drawing, of course, takes much more time to be written. And I think somehow this new digital era, so swamped with images, where time is literally gold, there's also the need to represent words in an attempt to get closer to the crafts. And finally, what that means to highlight that time has been spent to make it. Then I found out the Tiffany writing. The Tiffany writing is the writing system of the Tuaregs from North Africa. And because they're nomads, you can find this writing in caves in the walls of the deep Sahara. Here you can see some examples of the Tiffany writing. Some people defend that this is one of the oldest of writings. It is really weird. It looks from outer space, or if it even older than human race, but it is very much alive. And I also found the work of Labib, which creates an abstract calligraphy based on the Tiffany writing, moving it out from the folkloric decoration and that of a high art on par with his competitor Arabic calligraphy. So this was pretty much the cocktail that I started to work with. I began to draw some characters with that kind of visual tone in mind. And then I tried to apply some rules to it so that it became consistent, as if it was actually designing an alphabet. So I broke the characters in two parts so that the X height would include the body and a kind of upper terminals. And then I also found this way of coloring Tiffany that reminded me of the Book of Kells. And I applied it to the abstract shapes. And then I began to experiment with this kind of shapes, with these rules. And then I had to decide how I would hide a message in there so that people from all over could read something there. So the idea was to show pictures within the letters. So that would be the way everyone would be able to read or understand something. So I made a very simple portrait of the founder of the festival, and began to break it and melt it into the letters. So here you can see some characters and a highlight of the portrait. So in this case, the structure was fundamental to read the image as a writing system, not as an illustration. And here you can see the final spread and the detail. In the next spread, I thought I could talk about Barcelona. That's where the festival takes place. So I made a very simple portrait of the Sagrada Familia and the waves for the Mediterranean. And also a globe for its global approach. Here you can see a little detail of the book. And the final stop is 100% illustration. So many of you may have thought of Keith Haring when you saw these last pictures. And it is a link also with the last and following project, which besides being an illustration, it has a similar approach. So Saint Felix is the patron saint of my town, which is near Barcelona. Is the town where I am from, where I grew up. And it is traditional that every year a different local artist is asked to draw a portrait of him for the festival that takes place at the end of August. So he's more like an icon of the town, that's something religious related. So for you to understand me, he would be like the Elvis Presley from the town. Everybody loves him, whether you're religious or not, and they do all this big thing around him. So he isn't even living inside the church. He lives in the people's living rooms throughout the year. and only stays in the church the day of the festival. He even has a Facebook account, a Twitter account. People tag him all over. So yeah. So when I had this commission, I was living in LA, and I had the studio next to this mural from Rip Kronk in Venice Beach. And it was a big illustration made of broken lines. And I thought it could be a nice metaphor of the saint who is an icon because all the inhabitants of the town decided so. Because the sculpture itself, of course, is nothing. So I began to draw just like in the last project, but here without any structure, like much more randomly, having a basic rule in typography in mind, like looking for a balance between the foreground, the background, paying attention to the white shapes as much as the black ones. So here you can see a highlight of the saint, for those who haven't seen it. And then began to color it a little bit randomly, so it would be kind of game to find him for the inhabitants of my town. Finally, when I see this, is this an ampersand? Is this an illustration of an ampersand? Like my mom, what do I tell her? Which territory does it belong? So I recently read a very categorical argument that would clearly stand up for this being an illustration or whatever, but not typography. My opinion here is that typography cannot be isolated from other communicative modes, like it happens a lot of time. And because type was invented to communicate with the same result as the spoken word, which is understanding. But like the spoken word that also communicates with its tone, its volume, its gestures, type is integrated with other semiotic means of expression such as color, texture, three-dimensionality, movement. And type can become the message itself and can worth 1,000 pictures. And that's it. Thank you very much.